This video audits the official story of Stonehenge, using brute force logistics and engineering constraints as the only standard of proof. The official story is that Stonehenge is a ceremonial monument for tracking the solstices, but that explanation immediately collides with a wall of pure, brute force cost. Look, a simple wooden stake hammered into the ground does the exact same job for almost zero investment and can be set up in a single afternoon by one person. We have to stop asking how they built it and start asking why they paid a price that makes absolutely no sense for the stated outcome. What were they buying with that level of investment? The formal explanation on the table is that Stonehenge was a ceremonial site, built in phases between 3000 and 2000 BCE by Neolithic people. This official story must account for the largest components, the sarsen stones, weighing up to 50 tons each, being moved approximately 32 kilometers from the Marlborough Downs. A practitioner checks the manifest first. You can verify the origin by mapping the stone's specific geology back to the quarry, which has been done and confirmed. The problem isn't the distance itself, which is just a number. The problem is the motive. You cannot cheat constraints. Does a ceremony, no matter how important, justify a multi-generational infrastructure project of this scale against the daily cost of survival? Let's apply pressure to the inputs for moving a single 50-ton sarsen stone. The consensus model involves sledges, likely moving over a prepared track of timber, rollers, or rails. Think about the resource cost of that track alone. This requires felling hundreds of mature trees just to create a temporary roadbed, a roadbed that wears out and must be constantly replaced as the stone progresses. You can calculate the sheer volume of timber required, not just for the track, but for the sledge and rollers themselves, which would be crushed or worn down under the load. Reality does not care about good intentions. This isn't a one-time cost. It's a massive, ongoing drain on the most valuable building material available to a Neolithic society. How can a project justify consuming an entire forest for a task that a simple stick in the dirt could accomplish? The caloric cost of the workforce is another hard constraint that cannot be ignored. To move a 50-ton object over uneven terrain, even with the aid of rollers and tracks, requires an immense and coordinated application of force by hundreds of adults. We can model the energy expenditure, the sheer number of calories burned per hour by that workforce. This isn't a weekend project. Moving a single stone would be a campaign lasting weeks, demanding a food surplus sufficient to feed a non-productive army of laborers. Be honest, where did that surplus come from in a pre-industrial farming society where a single bad harvest meant starvation? What breaks first, the ropes or the supply line? And it wasn't just one type of stone, which introduces another layer of logistical absurdity. The project also demanded blue stones, smaller but still weighing 1 to 5 tons each, moved an incredible 140 to 240 kilometers from the Preseli Hills in Wales. This is not a local project. This is a regional, multi-generational obsession that makes no practical sense. You can verify the origin of these specific stones through geological fingerprinting, matching their mineral composition directly to their source quarries. The logistics of moving them, likely by a combination of sea raft and overland hauling with ropes and manpower, are staggering. If this was just about building a temple with big rocks, why haul these specific, smaller stones over such an impossible distance from another country? The official explanation for the bluestones is that they had cultural or symbolic significance, perhaps from an ancestral homeland. But let's run a simple cost-benefit check on that idea. The cost is an expeditionary-level logistical operation, spanning hundreds of kilometers of dangerous terrain and open water, repeated dozens of times. The benefit is symbolic. Any practitioner knows you have to weigh the cost of acquisition against the value of the asset. Stop buying it. At some point, the cost becomes so prohibitive that a substitute would be found. The decision to pay this price over and over suggests the material itself was seen as non-negotiable and irreplaceable for a functional purpose. How can mere symbolism justify a cost that borders on the insane? Let's drill down on the timber supply chain, because it's the single greatest bottleneck for the official construction method. To move all 80 sarsen stones over 32 kilometers, you need a trackway. Let's be conservative and say the trackway is only ever 100 meters long, constantly being picked up from behind and moved to the front. The number of trees required to build and maintain even this short, rolling road is enormous. You can map the local forests of the time. They were not infinite. This project represents a deliberate act of mass deforestation for a non-essential purpose. What was the secondary impact of removing that much primary forest from the local ecosystem that supported the builders? The sledge itself is a piece of engineering that is casually brushed over. Think, a sledge carrying 50 tons needs to be a monolithic structure made from the largest, straightest, strongest trees available. We can model the stresses. A pieced-together sledge would simply tear itself apart under the torsional loads of being dragged over uneven ground. This implies a highly selective logging operation, targeting only the most massive, old-growth trees. These champion trees are a rare resource in any forest. The check is to inventory the forest for such specimens. Where did they find 80-plus perfect trees of that size? And what else were they giving up by using them for disposable sledges? Now consider the ropes. Miles and miles of rope, thick enough to have a breaking strength of many tons. The official story assumes these were made from plant fibers or leather. Do the simplest check. Calculate the amount of raw material, flax, lime bark, or the hides of hundreds of cattle required to produce just one of the main hauling ropes. Then multiply that by the number of ropes needed, plus spares, because ropes under this kind of strain will constantly chafe and snap. Reality does not care. This represents an entire secondary industry, a massive production line for cordage, operating at a scale that would tax the resources of the entire region. How was this rope factory supplied, managed, and staffed for centuries? Let's talk about the workforce's food supply in more detail. The evidence from the nearby settlement of Durrington Walls shows massive-scale feasting on pigs and cattle. The official story frames this as a perk, a reward for the builders. But a logistics manager sees a massive liability. These animals were brought from as far away as Scotland, hundreds of kilometers. You can verify this using isotopic analysis of the animal bones. This isn't just feeding your workers. This is importing luxury goods over vast distances for a barbecue. This exponentially increases the project's complexity and cost. Who is managing this continental-scale catering operation? And why was a simple project of religious observation burdened with a supply chain worthy of a royal army? Any practitioner will tell you that a multi-generational project is the hardest thing to manage. The official timeline for Stonehenge spans 1,000 years, with construction phases separated by centuries. Be honest. How do you maintain unity of purpose, transfer engineering knowledge, and secure resource allocation across 40 generations? Societies change, religions shift, climates alter, and wars happen. A project this expensive and this slow is an easy target for a new leader wanting to make a mark by cancelling it and using the resources elsewhere. The Czech is human history. We have almost no examples of such a singular, non-essential vision being maintained for a millennium. What mechanism of social control was so powerful that it could bind dozens of generations to a single, astronomically expensive blueprint? The choice of stone wasn't just about durability, it was about absurdity. The official story says sarcens and bluestones were chosen because they are hard rocks that would last, unlike the local chalk. That's a fundamental engineering constraint. But this only explains why they didn't use chalk. It doesn't explain why they went 32 kilometers for 50-ton sarcens, when smaller, more manageable sarcens were available closer. It doesn't explain why they went 240 kilometers for bluestones, when other hard, durable, and symbolic stones were available everywhere in between. You cannot cheat the logic of logistics. The builders consistently chose the most difficult, most expensive, most labor-intensive option available at every stage. Why does the official story of permanence require a path of maximum, almost performative, inefficiency? Let's pivot the lens from the materials to the geometry. The official story states the layout is a celestial calendar with clear alignments to the solstices. This is true. You can measure the placement of the stones today with modern survey equipment. The precision of these astronomical alignments is roughly 1 to 2 degrees. This is perfectly adequate for naked eye observation. But here's the contradiction. The precision of the construction, the mortise and tenon joints, the smoothing of the stones, the lintel curvature, is of a far higher order than the calendar function requires. Think. Why would you build a Swiss watch just to tell you if it's day or night? The level of effort in the stonework is completely mismatched with the low precision requirement of the stated celestial function. What other function demanded this level of obsessive craftsmanship? Let's apply pressure to the mortise and tenon joints. This is a sophisticated woodworking technique brilliantly applied to stone, designed to lock the lintels onto the upright sarcens. The official explanation is that this provides stability against earthquakes or time. But a simple check on the geology of Salisbury Plain shows it to be one of the most seismically stable parts of Britain. And for stability against gravity, simply placing a heavy, flat lintel on 2 heavy, flat-topped uprights is more than sufficient, as demonstrated by thousands of other megalithic structures. Stop buying it. These joints are an incredible, costly, and structurally redundant feature. They are a solution to a problem the structure doesn't have. Why invest thousands of hours of skilled labor carving these precise joints if they weren't functionally necessary for some other, unstated purpose? The argument about the builders themselves is another weak point. The official narrative credits Neolithic people using bone, antler, and stone tools. We find these tools, and you can carbon date them to confirm their age. But the presence of simple tools does not preclude the existence of a more advanced knowledge base. Any practitioner knows the difference between the tools used for grunt work and the instruments used for surveying and planning. The simple tools explain the how of the carving, but they don't explain the why of the layout's precision or the what of the incredible logistical organization. The physical evidence of the simple tools is a fact, but it is not a complete explanation. How can the crudest of tools be the sole explanation for one of the most sophisticated logistical and engineering feats of the ancient world? Let's go back to Durrington Walls and the feast. The sheer volume of animal bones indicates gatherings on a scale previously unimaginable for Neolithic Europe. The official story paints this as a kind of unifying, pan-regional festival. But look at the logistics from a darker angle. A central authority capable of demanding and receiving tribute in the form of thousands of prime livestock from hundreds of kilometers away is a massive concentration of power. This wasn't a potluck. This was a tax. The check is simple. Who benefits? The feasting evidence could equally support a narrative of a powerful, coercive elite who commanded the resources of a vast territory to build their monument. Why is the benign, happy builders story preferred over a more plausible model of centralized power and coercion? Consider the sheer, almost irrational scale of the project as a piece of sacred infrastructure. The argument is that, like modern cathedrals or stadiums, the cost is justified by the social cohesion it creates. But there's a key difference. A cathedral is a functional space. A stadium hosts events. They have a continuous, observable utility. Stonehenge, according to the official story, had a peak utility of 2 days a year, the solstices. For the other 363 days, it was a static, unused object. Be honest. No society, ancient or modern, dedicates this level of multi-generational capital investment to a facility with a 0.5% utilization rate. What were they doing there the rest of the time that justified this cost? The official story is often misrepresented as being only about a primitive solar calendar. The more nuanced version adds that it was a place of burial for honored dead, a site for feasts, and a symbol of identity. But this just deepens the problem. You can verify the burials and the feasting through the archaeological record. But these functions don't require 50-ton stones or a 240-kilometer supply chain. A simple earth barrow is a tomb. A field is a place for a feast. The core question remains unanswered. Why was this specific, impossibly difficult architectural form required for these common ritualistic activities? Why does combining several simple functions suddenly demand the most complex and costly solution imaginable? Let's consider the failure modes of the system. The official explanation of a ceremonial center is robust. It's a passive structure. It can't really fail. It just has to stand there. But this very robustness is suspicious. Any large-scale engineering project has to contend with risk: accidents, material failure, weather, human error. Moving a 50-ton stone is a high-risk operation. The check is simple. Where is the evidence of failure? Where are the sarcens that were dropped and cracked en route? Where are the half-finished earthworks from a failed attempt? The archaeological record shows a near-perfect execution of an incredibly difficult plan. Stop buying the narrative. of simple farmers learning as they go. This level of success implies a mature, well-practiced methodology that we have no other evidence for. How can a project of this complexity have a near-zero failure rate on the first try? Now let's talk about the bluestones again, because the fact they were hauled from so far is the linchpin of the entire logistical absurdity. The mainstream archaeological view is that their value was not in their composition, but in their origin story. They came from a sacred landscape. But this is a circular argument. We call the landscape sacred because the stones were taken from it. Do the simplest check. Can you name any other example in human history where a culture transported dozens of multi-ton objects over 240 kilometers, including a sea crossing, purely because they came from a special place? The effort is so far out of proportion to the symbolic benefit that it demands a better explanation. Is symbolic value just a placeholder for a function we don't yet understand? Think about the resources again, the full supply chain, as a system. To move one 50-ton sarsen, you need a team for logging, a team for rope making, a team for food procurement, a team of haulers, a team of track layers, and a team of managers. This is a complex, multi-layered organization. Now multiply that for 80 sarsens and dozens of bluestones over centuries. Reality does not care about neat diagrams. This entire system has to be managed without writing, without currency, without wheeled transport. The primary bottleneck isn't technology, it's information management. How do you coordinate the schedules, material needs, and personnel of a dozen different specialized teams over 1,000 years, using only memory and oral tradition? The organizational challenge is a far greater miracle than the engineering. Let's apply pressure to the timeline itself. The construction happened in phases, spread out over a millennium. The official story presents this as evidence of a stable, enduring culture. But any engineer or project manager sees the opposite. A 1,000-year project with centuries of downtime between phases is a project that is constantly on the verge of failure. It's a project that repeatedly lost funding, political will, or the necessary knowledge base, only to be revived generations later. This isn't a sign of stability. It's a sign of a desperate, recurring struggle to complete something that was almost beyond the society's capacity. Why was it so important to keep restarting this impossibly difficult project after centuries of neglect? The core contradiction remains the motive. The mainstream story suggests that the ritual was everything, that it was their science, their government, their connection to the divine. This is an attempt to justify the cost by inflating the value of the benefit. But it's an untestable claim. We are asked to believe that their worldview was so different from ours that a cost-benefit analysis is irrelevant. This is a convenient way to avoid the hard questions. You cannot cheat constraints. All human societies, at all times, are constrained by the realities of resource scarcity and energy expenditure. To suggest these constraints didn't apply to the builders of Stonehenge is to treat them as magical beings, not as people. How can an explanation be considered scientific if its central premise is that the basic laws of economics and logistics didn't apply? Let's do one final pass on the evidence for the official story, a final cross-examination of the physical constraints. The story claims the motive was ceremony and a calendar. Check. The cost is astronomically higher than the function requires, a fatal mismatch. The story claims the builders were simple Neolithic farmers. Check. The required logistical and organizational sophistication is on par with a state-level society, not a loose collection of farming communities. The story claims the multi-generational timeline shows stability. Check. It could equally show a project that was constantly failing and being restarted. At every single point of contact with the hard realities of logistics, resource management, and human nature, the official story becomes thin and requires special pleading. It explains what Stonehenge is, but it completely fails to explain why it is. Now, an alternative hypothesis has been proposed. Let's state it clearly. The hypothesis is that Stonehenge was a form of high-frequency energy transmitter built by an advanced, ancient civilization. This idea proposes these builders used special properties of the stones to harness and broadcast energy. This theory attempts to provide a functional reason for the incredible cost and precision. However, this alternative also runs into a wall of constraints. Proponents claim the builders needed quartz-bearing bluestones for a piezoelectric effect. The check is simple: assay the stones. Geologists have done this. While some bluestones do contain quartz, they lack the purity, the quantity, and, most importantly, the uniform crystal alignment needed for any meaningful energy generation. You cannot cheat the laws of materials science. If these were critical electronic components for a machine, wouldn't they be the highest possible grade available, not just random rocks from a distant hill? Any practitioner will tell you that a functional machine requires specific, high-quality components manufactured to a known tolerance. The transmitter claim is that Stonehenge was a machine. But the stones are a hodgepodge of different geological types. The evidence on the ground even shows some of these bluestones were recycled from an older stone circle, worn Morn. You can verify this by matching empty stone holes at one site to the dimensions and geology of the stones at the other. Stop buying it. People do not build a high-tech device out of salvaged, second-hand parts with sentimental value. So why move used stones hundreds of kilometers if not for their history and symbolic meaning, a motive the official story relies on, but cannot justify at this scale? This transmitter theory also needs a more advanced builder, proposing pre-flood engineers or a lost global civilization. But the facts on the ground are stubborn. The tools recovered from the site are exclusively made of bone, antler, and stone, consistent with the known technology of the Neolithic. You can carbon date these artifacts to confirm their age. There is zero physical evidence, not a single misplaced tool, not one metallic fragment, not a single inscription that suggests anyone other than the people we know existed at that time. How can a theory survive with no physical proof of its most fundamental claim? Furthermore, the transmitter theory needs a power source. One claim is that it harnessed the Earth's natural seismic microvibrations. This sounds plausible until you do the simplest check. The amount of energy present in these tiny vibrations is negligible. Any physicist will tell you that the power you could extract, even with 100% efficiency, is infinitesimally small, far too little to power anything significant. You cannot cheat the laws of thermodynamics. Where is the physical evidence for any energy harvesting mechanism at all, let alone one that fundamentally defies the known laws of physics? So, the alternative hypothesis, while attempting to answer the why, fails the how. It creates a fictional builder using fictional physics to operate a fictional machine. It is a solution in search of a problem, a story built on speculation rather than evidence. It is just as unsatisfying as the official narrative, because it, too, requires us to ignore the physical constraints we can measure and test right now. Why trade one set of unproven assumptions for another, equally unsupported set? This leaves us in an uncomfortable position. The official story, the ceremonial monument, fits the cultural evidence, but is logistically and motivationally absurd. The alternative story, the transmitter, attempts to solve the motivation, but is physically and archaeologically impossible. What breaks first is the idea that we have only two options. Be honest. Both popular explanations fail under cross-examination. One fails the test of logistics and economics. The other fails the test of physics and archaeology. The problem is not that we need to pick one. The problem is that neither works. The verdict, after cross-examining the claims against the hard constraints of reality, is clear. The official explanation of a ceremonial monument fails the audit. It crumbles under the weight of its own logistical impossibilities. It fails to provide a rational motive for the astronomical and multi-generational investment of time, resources, and labor. The cost is verifiable and massive. The proposed benefit is unquantifiable, speculative, and insufficient. The official story does not solve the riddle. It is the riddle. The only enduring mystery is not how they built it, but why the explanation we are given is a fiction that so profoundly disrespects the scale of their achievement. If you appreciate this kind of forensic breakdown, subscribe for more.